Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist. I'm glad you could be with me today. I'm in a different spot this week. We move around from time to time, and the classroom that we're using today happens to be studying the same book of Daniel, apparently, along with us, because there's a poster of King Nebuchadnezzar's vision in the background that you might see there. So today we're going to be studying chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. And I think the way that this chapter was written is kind of interesting, because it's sort of written as first person King Nebuchadnezzar. You know, he's saying these things. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, did this, that, or the other thing. And I get the idea, me, I'm always using my imagination. I get the idea that King Nebuchadnezzar had Daniel there close by, because Daniel is, in the court with him, as it has been said previously. And so, he says, write this down, Daniel. You're writing all these things down. Write this down. I want this to be written down. So he's sort of almost helping to dictate what's going to be written. You can sort of read it that way. And so at the beginning of chapter 4, it's in that first person where Nebuchadnezzar says, now, the very first part, it says, may your peace abound. The Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. So Nebuchadnezzar, at the point that these things were written down, he has had a change of his attitude, I guess you might say, towards the Most High God. And so then he relates the circumstances of how that happened. And so Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and in the dream he saw this big tree, and then the tree was chopped down, and then just the stump remained, and it had a band of iron around it, and the green grass and foliage was all around it, and the beasts of the field. And so he didn't know what this dream meant, but it was troubling to him. And so he calls Daniel to interpret his dream. And so he says, again in the first person, this is the dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for a spirit of the holy gods is in you. So that phrase, a spirit of the holy gods, is used several times in the book of Daniel as the way that the people from Babylon, the officials from Babylon, or whoever, referred to Daniel as having a spirit of the holy gods. Now we know he had the spirit of the holy God, and that there is only one. There's not multiples, but in their minds there could be many gods, and Daniel has the spirit of one of them, in him. And so this is the way that they might view it. And so Daniel comes and he interprets the vision. He doesn't want to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what the dream meant, but Nebuchadnezzar says, don't let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Go ahead and tell me what it says. And so Daniel tells him then, this big tree is you, O king, and it says, a holy one descended from heaven and said, chop down the tree and destroy it. Leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field. And you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And then the stump is remaining because your kingdom will be given back to you after you recognize that it's heaven that rules. And so then Daniel ends up his interpretation in verse 27 by saying, therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So Daniel, gives him that little warning at the end that, hey, you need to change your ways right now, and perhaps God will not make this dream come true, and he'll, back off from doing what he's planned for you. And so that's where our lesson begins then, is with verse 28. And so the background then is that Daniel has given this interpretation. Now, let's read verses 28 to 30. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? So King Nebuchadnezzar obviously did not listen to the dream, did he? And he went ahead and of course, it's been a year has passed, and maybe he thought, well, that dream was nothing, And so he makes this statement about his majesty and his power and his glory and all of those things. And so that he was, this is the beginning then of the fulfillment of the dream, because Nebuchadnezzar still had that attitude that he had had before. So let's look at verses 31 to 32. While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. So, just as Daniel had predicted, this voice comes from heaven, and God speaks to Nebuchadnezzar and says, look, right when Nebuchadnezzar has finished making his bold statement, while the word was still in his mouth, it says, a voice came from heaven, and then this is what God said to him. You're going to go out and you're going to eat grass like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you. And I think in some sources it says 7 years. So in verse 33, immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And so, when God speaks something like this, sometimes there might be a waiting period, but sometimes there's no waiting period. Immediately it happens. So immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. So he went out, he lost his mind. He became insane and went out and began to eat grass and live in the field, and his hair grew long and matted, as you can imagine, in dreadlocks or whatever, and his nails were long like bird's claws, it says. In your book it also says bird's claws. And so he was just insane then. For 7 years he continued like that. And so then we get to the end of those days. So verses 34 and 35. But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, so again, the first person retelling of it, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion, now he's telling about the Most High, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So that is Nebuchadnezzar's description of the Most High God. And so Nebuchadnezzar has had his eyes opened, hasn't he? And he has been humbled for 7 years, and his reason now has returned to him, and obviously he's learned a lesson, because then now he's able to understand that it's not he, Nebuchadnezzar, that's so great and majestic and glorious, but it is the Most High God who has dominion over everything, all the inhabitants of the earth. His will is done among the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or stop God from doing what he has decided to do, or say to him, "What have you done?" So in other words, no one can question God and have a result, in saying, "What have you done? You shouldn't have done that," and change God's mind if God has made up his mind to do something. Then he goes on again in the first person to the end of this chapter. At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So this whole chapter, I think of it like Nebuchadnezzar's testimony written down. This is what happened to me. God humbled me, and now I understand, and God is the one that's great, and he does, testify at the end how his kingdom was restored to him, his sovereignty or his rule over the kingdom, his and it says, surpassing greatness was added to me. So in other words, God allowed his rule and reign and majesty or whatever to be restored. But Nebuchadnezzar has a different attitude now. And now he can praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven. So he has recognized that God is the king, and that Nebuchadnezzar is under his authority. And he says all of his works are true, his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. I think it's interesting that we are studying this lesson, and that's where our verses end for this week. But I think it's interesting that we're studying this lesson on the very week that all of these things are happening in Russia, where we see like a dictator, gaining more power and feeling invincible and doing whatever he wants, and it would be good for him to go and read this story of Nebuchadnezzar and how God, if he chooses to do so, could do the same exact thing to him. He could lose his sanity in an instant and be out eating grass like cattle if God chose to do that. And it would behoove him to read this chapter. Of course, I don't think he has reading the Bible in mind right now, but it's a word of caution to all of us, isn't it? Because we need to be reminded. We people, just like Nebuchadnezzar, after a year, all of a sudden he comes out with this bold statement, about how great he is. A year after the dream. Maybe right at first, after the dream, he was like, wow, I should watch it or whatever. Daniel's warned me and maybe I should shape up, But then after a while, it just went to his head again. And he came out with this statement. But for all of us, because we are human and we are fallible, we need to be reminded often that God is God and we're not. God is in control. God is the one with the majesty and the power. We are powerless to have an effect on God or to, to change God's mind from what he may want to do or his plans for the universe, God. Not only that, I guess I saw a quote this week that said, we all need to remember that God is still on the throne and he's still in charge. Even when things seem chaotic and crazy and, these things that are happening in our world today seem out of control, God is still on the throne and he allows events of the world to happen in a certain way because he has a plan in place that he's working out. There's a bigger picture to all of it that we don't understand. We might get a glimpse and we might say, oh, Jesus is going to return soon, but we really don't know that. We see events happening and we think, wow, this is unusual. And perhaps this is going to be the time that Jesus returns. But we don't know that for sure. But rest assured that God knows exactly what's going on. He has his plan in place, and it is actively working out. And just like Nebuchadnezzar said, no one can ward off the hand of God. There's not anyone that can stop God's plan from happening in the way that he has planned for it. And so we can have that assurance, in knowing that we don't have to be in charge. There is someone in charge who knows what he's doing. He's wise and all-powerful, and he knows what he's doing. And so when we feel confused and are afraid, and we don't know what's going to happen next. It just seems like everything bad is happening or whatever. We can encourage ourselves to know that God is still in charge. He sees us, and he sees the things we're going through, and we can have confidence in knowing that He has this plan that is working out. Before I stop, I want to tell you a little story that I heard this week, because I thought it was an example of the way that God works, and with the dreams of Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar's dreams and Daniel's interpretation and all of that. It reminded me of it when I heard this story, and this was something that happened just a couple of weeks ago. One of the groups that works with us in Global Gates went to a foreign country. They were young people that were being trained in mission, how missions works, and what missionaries do and things like that. And so they went then to a foreign country to sort of experience that and practice sharing the gospel in a foreign country like that. And so one of the girls in the group, she kept having a vision or a dream of a lady beside the water crying. And she had this dream several times, or this vision several times. And so when they went there then to that foreign country, this girl was walking along the edge of a big lake that was there, and she saw this lady crying, and she knew this was the thing she had dreamed about. She went to the lady and talked to her, and that lady accepted Christ. And so, when you hear something like that, that happened 2 weeks ago. That happened to people that we know and things like that. Then you see more and more that God is in control. And even though Nebuchadnezzar was such a powerful dictator at the time, God was much more powerful than him, wasn't he? We can take confidence in that. So thank you for studying with me this week. And our next lesson then is going to jump over to Daniel chapter 6. And so I would suggest reading chapters 5 and 6, and then we'll jump forward, because I will mention some things from chapter 5 as well. And I'll see you next time.